As Omnideus United Church of the Righteous burned down in flames, I sat contentedly in the massive cemetery that surrounded it. The thick eternal fog seemed to block the smoke from me. Naked as my shadow, still covered in soot and dried blood, I played with that red serpent, talking to him, telling him my story as if he could reply, but of course he didn't. All that remained of the church was a desecrated, smoking pile of scorched rubble. As I explored the charred ruins, I noticed some sort of sheet of paper flying through the breeze above me. Soon it landed in the ash, and upon investigating I discovered that it was a familiar piece of art. It was Magdalena's drawing of all of us as children playing in the cemetery. The edges were burned all the way around, but it was otherwise still intact. Though I smiled and gazed upon it, tears escaped my eyes as well, and I couldn't tell if they were of relief that it was all over, or the pain of missing them. Perhaps it was a mixture of both. I decided to explore what remained of my destroyed world. Ashes and embers seemed to fall everywhere I looked. The stench of burned flesh filled the air, but I found no corpses, and I saw no one in the foggy paths. The entire village was strangely empty. Most of the dilapidated houses I came across looked as if they had been lived in. The strange thing, however, was that within them there was always food on the table, clothes in the closets. Everyone in the congregation had seemingly disappeared, leaving everything behind. The only living beings left in this world seemed to be myself and my red serpent. I named him Lucifer, after my guardian. He was my only friend, and I loved him, but sometimes I'd find myself wishing he actually could talk. In the cold nights, I would get especially lonely. I longed for the touch, the fiery embrace of my horned shadow, but he never appeared again. It was blatant, obvious, as clear as that holy water acid that he never existed in the first place. Him expressing his love for me was just me finally accepting self-love, and making love to him was simply me accepting the parts of me that my religious trauma deemed evil and sinful. In all ways, he was a reflection of me, simply comforting myself within the jagged, bloody shards of the broken mirror that was my shattered sanity. Similarly, the other monsters I had seen were simply hallucinations. I had truly lost my mind to the church, and now I was regaining it. But if this was true, then who was it that flipped the fountain? Soon I realized that the village, or what remained of it, was haunting me. Everywhere I looked, I could see silhouettes in the fog of Magnus, of Mary, of Esther, Magdalena, Lucas, Levi, of my horned shadow, Lucifer. Unfortunately, they were all just mirages. I was cripplingly alone. I decided to explore the deadwood. Levi was right. It was eerily empty and seemingly endless, and within it I lost track of my serpentine companion, but I kept moving through it in the same direction for what seemed like years. At night I would rest by trying to sleep in the dirt, but it proved to be rather difficult for me. What little food I could find, such as mushrooms and berries, as rare as they were, I ravenously ate, which sometimes made me sick for days. Early one morning in the milky twilight, I noticed something odd during one of these bouts of sickness. The usually bluish fog was now an eerie green, and I immediately had trouble breathing within it. What began as a simple tickle in my throat worsened until it felt as if my insides were on fire. Coughing only increased the pain, but I couldn't stop. By this point, my very skin had begun to burn. I watched my hands slowly redden as boils arose from them. In that moment, I remembered my parents' bedtime stories. They were true. The air in at least part of the dead wood was toxic. Still coughing uncontrollably, I struggled to stand. Limping my way between the dead trees, I began to weep. All of my strength had been sapped from me by the sickness, and soon I collapsed before the creek that I had drank from earlier during the night prior. Suffering, I lied there, watching it rush by. In the light of day, I was able to see the few dead fish floating about within it, their milky eyes frozen in time. Atop the water was a thin, iridescent film of something I did not recognize, and a strange scent was wafting up from it into my nose. It was then that I noticed an animal drinking from it on the other side. It was a massive white buck, but it seemed deformed in the most eerie of ways. There was a large growth on the side of its neck, twisting its head until it was almost upside down. I was being stalked by Sarah's demons, I thought, though it did not seem to hunger for my flesh. The corrupted creature was simply drinking from the clearly tainted water, just like I had been mere hours earlier. As it raised its large head, I noticed Lucifer, my red snake, slithering toward the water between its legs. This worried me at first, but thankfully my little friend did not drink. Instead, it raised its head up and flashed its forked tongue at me, seemingly to get my attention, and as it turned around and slithered deeper into the forest, I tried to pull myself up. At first I collapsed into the creek, splashing the buck and scaring it back deeper into the forest. But I tried again despite my pain and limped after my trusted animal companion. Despite my agony, my exhaustion, my sickness, my terror, I put one foot in front of the other and walked back the way I came. And as I followed my serpent, the green fog around me slowly faded back to its more familiar blue hue. My skin stopped burning, though the oozing, bleeding boils remained. Fresh air filled my quivering lungs through my throat, though my throat still raged with pain. After a few more days of walking in a completely different direction, Lucifer actually led me out of that accursed forest entirely. The dead trees were replaced by faded signposts, and the dirt paths became stone, and soon I found myself in a small town. Although it was much larger than my humble village, this town was just as dilapidated and desolate, and so I became a sort of nomad, roaming from town to town, searching, desperately searching. In my heart I hoped to find someone, anyone to talk to. Each house was just as empty as the last, however. My nightmares followed me throughout my travels. I dreamed that I was awakening in the convent, strapped to a bed every single night. There was no fire. Mags, Levi, Esther, and myself continued to suffer between those stark white walls for the rest of our lives, and I would always awaken in sobs, panicking, crying out for Lucifer, and while my loyal serpent would always come slithering toward me in the darkness, the horned shadow I longed for would never appear. The clothes that hadn't been completely eaten by moths I took and I wore. I slept in random houses each night, and I learned to hunt and gather food that wouldn't make me sick. What little I could find, anyway, but I kept moving from town to town. All of my burned skin healed eventually, but my throat seemed to always have a tickle in it, and whenever I would breathe deeply, more times than not, I would end up in a coughing fit. That toxic fog had done some irreversible damage, it seemed. Oddly, sometimes I thought I could hear people, voices, laughter echoing on the edges of the air itself. They always felt just out of reach. Perhaps they were simple echoes from my past, my mind longing for some sort of human connection. I began to question what was happening around me. Why was I suddenly so alone, seemingly abandoned by my community? The only conclusion I could come to was that the congregation didn't know the truth, or that they didn't want to accept it. They thought me evil for my actions and ran away, leaving me alone to rot. Did they truly think of me as the Antichrist, the man of sin, the lawless one, appearing through of rebellion and opposing their God? It all sounded like me. Perhaps I was the Antichrist. Maybe I had somehow triggered the rapture, and I was the only human that remained within the entire world. And there I was, circling back around to believing again. I felt like poor Esther in her recurring nightmare. Someone had sewn the severed bloody skin of Christ over me. No matter what I did, I couldn't escape him. When I looked in the mirror, I could only see the version of myself that God wanted me to be. The priest, the exorcist, in those extravagant robes that dripped gold and jewels, pretending to save the souls of the damned, when in reality I was nothing more than a violent murderer. Of course, all of these thoughts came crashing down around me on the day I found her. At first I thought it was Magdalena, lying on a bed in an empty house. She was much older than my childhood friend, but she looked exactly like her, right down to the round glasses and thick dark curls. Her body was still warm, her tears still sparkling in her frozen eyes. Sarah? I asked the corpse, tearing up. It's a shame that you were never able to meet her, but your daughter was one of my very best friends. I tried to be content for a while about my freedom, about the return of my snake, about being able to survive, but the truth was that I felt as though I had lost everything, including myself. If one believes in nothing but themselves, what is there to live for? What does it mean to live in general? Does anything even matter? If one's choices change nothing, if there is no outcome, then there is no point in existing. When severed from the fantasy of religion in the grand scheme of things amongst the entire universe, an individual is insignificant, especially when one finds himself completely and utterly alone. Soon I came across one of those depraved cities we were always warned about. Sodom and Gomorrah had become quite boring over the years, it seemed, because it was just as abandoned as the small towns I'd explored. But even in the eternal fog, it was strange and surreal to behold. Ruins of mirrored rectangular towers arose from the ground in all directions, which was covered entirely by different stone slabs. Black paths spiraled about the city. Scattered about on them were those odd wheeled carriages that I had seen in the council's realistic drawings. Above them hung massive contraptions on wire and strings attached to poles, all of which seemed to stretch throughout the massive expanse that made up the area. I searched that city for what seemed like forever. Other than the buildings themselves, I found not one sign of life. Not even skeletons were hidden there. Had it been so long since the cult destroyed the world that bones themselves had decayed away? When it rained there, I quickly realized that it was not water that fell from the white skies above. The droplets were discolored, sickly yellow, and they were irritating to my skin. They had a strange, pungent, unnatural stench, almost like dehydrated piss. Cradling my snake, I hid under a bridge during my first storm there, watching as itchy red ashes slowly formed on my wet hands. After this, I decided to keep moving. It was on the outskirts of that city that I began to think of a way out. After finding an old rope, I struggled to fashion it into a noose. In the dead of night, I threw it over a web-wrapped chandelier in the entrance hall of a dark and gloomy mansion. Standing on a rickety wooden stool, I placed the noose around my neck and closed my eyes for what I believed would be the last time. Taking a deep breath, I kicked the stool out from under me and collapsed through the air. The noose tightened around my throat and I immediately couldn't breathe. I had always thought that hanging oneself meant the rope was to break your neck in an instant and you would die experiencing little to no pain. But that isn't what happened to me at all. I suffered greatly, and in that long, long wait for death's warm embrace, I began to regret my decision, and this made me wonder if Magnus had done the same. As everything faded to black, a shrouded figure stepped out of the shadows. At first I believed it to be my guardian angel Lucifer, but it had no horns. Wrapping their arms around me, the stranger lifted me up as high as they possibly could, loosening the noose and allowing me to breathe again. I could hear them sniffling below me as they did this, as if they were softly, quietly crying. Wrapping my hands around the rope, I weakly pulled it from my neck, gazing down at my savior in confusion. Studying their moments, the sounds of their sniffles, the shape of their body, I became desperate to recognize them. While oxygen filled my weakened lungs, I began to cough. My vision darkened and I slowly lost consciousness. The last thing I saw was the person's dark, graying, scruffy, unkempt beard and their thick, full lips parting as they gasped in dark surprise. This time, my sleep was dreamless. Just warm, peaceful darkness surrounded me, cradling me. It was peaceful and it was restful. It was serene. It was restful. I woke the next day in a strange bed. Thankfully, I wasn't in another stark white room, but the large, ornate bedroom of that same mansion. Sitting on the edge of the massive canopy bed was a hooded being holding a bowl of what looked like steaming soup made of mushrooms and meat. They turned to me, but all I could see beneath the shadowy hood was a nose and neatly trimmed facial hair. He'd shaved in the night, it seemed. "Look, Levi?" I asked weakly. Dressed in a large black hooded robe that had long sleeves and ended at the waist, the person remained silent. He also wore thick black pants ripped at the knees that were made of a material I had never seen before. Wrapped around his hands were fingerless gloves. Upon his feet were boots. With his hand, he motioned for me to sit up, and when I did, he began to feed me the soup. When he did so, I noticed that he had no fingernails, and his hands looked to be incredibly burned. Within a few moments, I noticed my red snake spiraling up the stranger's leg. I watched it slither up to his knee. It was then that the being placed the spoon into the bowl and petted my serpentine companion. He wasn't frightened of it at all, actually. He acted as though he recognized it, and in that moment I knew for a fact that I was looking at Levi. Though he stayed with me, preparing food for us to share from the rations he had previously gathered, he remained silent for days. My attempts at getting out of bed were immediately met with him gently laying me back down within it. When I would try to converse with him, he would simply smile or tilt his head as replies if he didn't flat out ignore me. He did sleep in that same bedchamber, but he did so in a large red chair. Even when I told him the bed was big enough to share, he would simply shake his head, and when I would creep over to him at night to try and pull his hood away from his shrouded face, he would always awaken and gently stop me before walking me back over to the bed and putting me back in it. Our one-sided conversations passed the time for a bit. He really seemed to enjoy them, at least. Every time I looked to him, he was smiling at me, waiting to hear more of my journey. But a festering bitterness was rising within me. I was beginning to resent his secrecy. Eventually, I had finally had enough, and one night I gave him an ultimatum. Either show me your face and truly become my friend and companion, or remain a stranger and let me leave this place, I demanded. You cannot be both. Sitting in that wretched chair, he had been quietly playing with Lucifer. Taking a deep breath, he released him onto the red carpet between us and slowly raised his hands to his hood. Pulling it down and back, he revealed what little remained of that beautiful, handsome face I once knew. Red, severe burns trailed from his right shoulder over his neck across the right side of his face and over the rest of his head in its entirety. Within that burn was his right eye, which had been rendered milky white, and his head was completely bald, the burns preventing him from growing any hair from his scalp. His ears had both seemingly burned away, leaving nothing but holes on the sides of his head. Those sad eyes, one brown, one white, immediately rolled up with tears. Seeing this, my heart broke. I stood up and walked over to him. Wrapping my arms around him, I sat down beside him and we held one another, softly weeping. "I'm sorry. I didn't want you to ever see me like this," he sobbed, hiding his face in my neck between my chest and chin. His voice was rough, damaged from the smoke. "I've grown ugly, like a demon from scripture, but when I saw you with that rope, I shook my head and, placing my hands to his shoulders, pushed him forward so that I could look him in the eyes. "You're more beautiful now than you've ever been, Levi," I said, just before leaning in and kissing his lips. This kiss was short and sweet, and in pulling away, I smiled as I gazed into his surprised eyes. "And I love you." He gasped. For a moment he sat there, switching his twilit gaze back and forth between my eyes, searching them for something as he slowly arched his brows. "I've dreamed of hearing you say those words for so long," he breathlessly replied, just before passionately, slowly, tenderly kissing me. After a few moments, he began to explain to me that, even though he had pulled a number of people out of the fire, they had all seemingly vanished into the fog shortly after. Some sort of explosion erupted, sending him flying out of the convent, and when he awoke, he realized he'd been permanently scarred, hideously disfigured, but through his agony, he tried to look for everyone, for me. I made my way to the church and found you upstairs with the elders. They were pointing strange devices at you, so I did what I had to do and toppled over that angel acid fountain on them, but I ran away afterward. Did that answer the final question that had been squirming around my mind? Thinking it over, I returned to the bed. "And you never came across anyone else?" He shook his head. "After I ran away from the fires, I journeyed through the deadwood and found an empty town, and then another," he continued. "I journeyed through that city of towers out there and made this manor my home. But my hopes for finding anyone, had all but died at that point, until I saw you down in the entrance hall with that rope." Blinking, I sat up with my back against the large pink and red pillows that rested on the headboard. I then pulled Magdalena's drawing out of my pocket and unfolded it. As I gazed down at it, he sat atop the bed next to me and looked at it over my shoulder. "I killed your mother," I admitted, expecting him to be upset. When he didn't reply, I continued. "Along with my father and Pastor Blackburn, everyone else, the entire congregation, every person that lived in our village, they disappeared overnight. How? Why?" Putting his arm around me, he pulled me closer. "You did what needed to be done. I do not condemn you. I praise you," he whispered into my ear. "Everyone else, they aren't your responsibility. They never were. Worry not about the rest of the congregation. You and I are all that matters now, my love." He then gently began to kiss my ear, my neck, and my cheek. I found his words a bit saccharine, but sincere nevertheless. My eyes were locked on that drawing, however. "I keep thinking there was more that I could have done," I said, shaking my head as tears filled my eyes. "Mags came into the convent to seek help with her seizures. Esther just wanted to trust the one that she called her husband. Father Magnus needed an escape from his dark duties, and Miss Mary just wanted to be able to be a mother for her children." Sniffling, I turned to him beside me. You saw the church for what it truly was, and I refused to believe you. And Lucas. Little Lucas was only protecting me from Pastor Blackburn when this nightmare began." Hearing these words, Levi began to tear up as well. He gently pulled my head to his chest. His cedar scent filled my nostrils once more. "I'm here, Joshua. I've got you. You're safe," he whispered, letting me cry. He took a deep, trembling breath, "and we can finally grieve in peace." Their memories stayed with us forever, for better or worse. We began to do things to honor them, like drawing for Magdalena and learning to make our own colorful clothes like Esther. Through us they lived, they breathed, they loved. We slowly made our way to the coast, where we saw the crystal clear teal waters of the sea for the very first time. There were healthy fish there, swimming about in the shallows, and crabs scuttling about on the sands. On the beach we had a picnic, and Levi played more music for me on his violin. Little Lucifer struggled to slither over the dunes, which we couldn't help but laugh at. I began a collection of seashells and shimmering stones, and in the twilight Levi and I made love for the very first time in beautiful serenity. There we found a small dilapidated boat and decided to work on it. After about a year it was able to sail. It took a little longer for us to learn how to do so, but after a while we gathered fresh rainwater to drink, a few mice for Lucifer to eat, and took off into the sea. While sailing we continuously fished and never went hungry. Levi and I slowly fell even deeper in love as we sailed the seas. We worked together to weather the storms and battle the tides, And the further we went from the church, the more the fog began to lift. For the first time, we experienced the warmth of the full sun's light, and eventually we found a small tropical island. There we found trees bearing fresh fruit, surrounded by vibrant green grass and actual flowers filling the air with the sweetest of scents. Fresh, clear, clean water flowed through that untouched land. There were even animals, the likes of which I had never seen or heard of. And it was all under bright blue, endless skies. At night they were covered in a dark blanket of glittering stars. Sometimes they were stormy, releasing healing rains that fed the earth, bathed us, and quenched our thirst. And during that, a few times they were illuminated with the breathtaking colors of Esther's beloved rainbow. We became each other's salvation. We became the true redeemers, if only for one another. And in and through our sin, we made our own heaven together. Now in our early 30s, the two of us have found the Garden of Eden, and here in paradise we spend our long lives in happiness and innocence, naked as Adam and Eve. We make love every morning and every night. He and I make friends of every animal, eat fruits from every tree, and absolutely nothing is forbidden. And when the day finally comes that we wither away and die, we will feed the earth with our bodies. Beautiful, multicolored, sweet-smelling flowers will grow from our corpses. The roots of towering trees will strengthen as they feed upon us. Through nature, we will continue to exist beyond our deaths. And that is all the eternal life we need. That is the end of The Exorcist, Acolyte, my horror novella. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. I really enjoyed writing this, and I'm very proud of it. You'll be able to download it, I think, tomorrow on Halloween for free as a PDF on my website. I really, really enjoyed writing this, and I'm very excited to be offering some kind of writing for free for everyone. Oh, it's just beautiful, especially the end. I really, really enjoyed writing this. As you can tell, I'm beaming right now. But, yeah, I'm planning on writing more for free. I don't know if I'm going to do, like, PDFs or actual books from my website and stuff anymore. I want to do, like, YouTube series that are scripted, like story times, and not story times, like fairy tales. I'm working on fairy tale stuff, making them darker like they used to be, and injecting some horror into them like they used to be, and just ripping Disney right out of it. But I love you guys, and I really hope you like this because I really enjoyed writing it. But I love you guys, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.
We were dead a long time ago. We've been ghosts since days of old. We were dead a long time ago. We're the ghosts of the stories you've told. We were dead a long time ago. We've been ghosts since the days of old. We were dead a long time ago. Ghosts in the scary stories you've told. Shadows in the moonlight. Creatures in the trees. Glowing eyes surround me as I question all I've seen. The past has come to haunt me. From within my shallow grave, my memories coming.